Yeah, Gerald, many thanks for agreeing to give us a bit of kind of insight into what things we can pretty much avoid when we are starting a transformation. So as mentioned in the invite, guys, we're looking at a lot of wisdom that has been accumulated by SAFe Fellows and the community and SPCTs and SPCs over the past, it's a decade, I think now. So it'd be great to hear that from Gerald. Now, note for Gerald, he's quite experienced in business and IT strategic advisory, Scaled Agile Program Consultant Trainer, SPCT, at Scaled Agile Inc. And he's focused on applying the Scaled Agile Framework to achieve business agility, small, medium, large enterprises. His background is in business analysis, development, and consulting. And pretty much he's across, well, mostly keeping it all pragmatic, guiding organization through the complexities of this significant transformation, as we know that Scaled Agile can be. So without any ado, just before I transfer to Gerald, please keep your phone on mute. Sorry, your microphone on mute. We'll have Q&A questions at the end. Please post your questions in the chat. So once once Gerald completes, we'll most likely have by that time, we'll have Rob Howard hopefully join us. So we'll get Rob Howard to give us a couple of news from the region. Rob is, by the way, the VP for Asia Pacific for Scaled Agile Inc. So he knows what's happening in our region. There is lots and lots of good news. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session. We're hoping to finish probably 10-15 minutes after the hour, but let's see how fast we go. So without any ado, Gerald, all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Michal. So good morning, everyone. Well, good afternoon for you. It's still morning for me because I'm in Singapore. So good afternoon, guys. Thank you very much for coming today. As Michal said, I'm Gerald Cadden. I work for Scaled Agile. I'm a strategic advisor and SPCT in the region for APAC. I was the only one out here, but we now have a colleague who's joined us in Japan. So I was looking after pretty much most of APAC, and I still do. But I now have some help in Japan, which is great because the language can be a challenge. So I've been around the Scaled Agile framework since it kind of began, although I didn't work for Scaled Agile till 2018, but I always worked for their partners. So I worked for a couple of different partners doing large transformations. So I've got plenty of experience around the framework. I like to take a pretty practical view and pragmatic view of the world, but I was a business analyst and developer before that. So lots of background for things. So it's enough about me. Plenty of questions. We'll have time for questions at the end, but if you feel like you have a question as we go, raise your hand and I'll try and answer the question as we go. Okay, let me get myself set here. So I've got to present. My desktop. Just confirm that you can all see my screen right now. Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. So let's go into the presentation mode. So the purpose of today's presentation is really to begin understanding, some of the major things we can stop, but people can stop doing when they're doing so. We have the framework roadmap here. So the SAFe implementation roadmap is something that tells us, all the things we should do when we're doing implementations. So training agents, forming the lays, identifying the value streams, creating the implementation plan, obviously all the training of roles. But what it really doesn't tell anybody is, well, what are all the things I shouldn't do? So as an SPC, when you get trained, you tend to think about this. I'm going to follow the roadmap, but you don't know all the pitfalls here. Actually, just let me ask, how many people on here are SPCs? Do I have a lot of SPCs here? If you pop your thumb up there on your usual virtual thumb. Andrew, I know, so a few others there. All right. Okay, so there's a few. So does that mean everybody else either has like an SA or some other form of certification? I'm hoping. I just want to find out, just making sure everybody's got some idea of what the framework is. So as I was saying, when we go around the roadmap, it tells us a lot of what we should do to get things implementation up and running, but not what we shouldn't do. And so we gave some thought to this, and this, Steve Maynard is the main author of this presentation, so I'm not going to take credit for writing the presentation. But we did give some thought to this, and we thought, well, we really should, have some things where we tell people what are the top things that we don't do. And so we spent a bit of time asking our, a community of SAFe Fellows and SPCTs, well, what are the top things that you would tell people to stop doing, or you had experience in stopping people doing when you've begun your implementations? And there was a lot of responses. I remember seeing the community post or the post that he did, and he got a lot of responses back. But one thing we did then as an advisory group was take a look through those different responses and kind of add our own thoughts in and just whittle it down to what we felt was the top 7 things that were most important for people to understand that, they should avoid doing when implementing the framework. And so without further ado, let's go in and start talking about these, okay? So the first one is not treating the framework as a prescriptive methodology. SAFe's not a method, it's a framework. It was designed to be, it was never designed to be a method where you follow the steps, right? It was designed to be, guidance that's built on success patterns and that's been placed together so people understand, in a way how to use it, but you're not really restricted on you have to do each one of those things. And so one of the things that we see is that it's there for the success patterns, but what typically happens is that during early implementations, inexperienced individuals, inexperienced SPCs or management start to work with this. And some of the things you can see here is they will SAFe says this. So they start following it like it's a book, follow the book, follow the instruction booklet. And we do all these things, right? Other things you might hear is, well, we have to do SAFe the right way. There's also, we've seen instances where people just pick up the reference guide and they start just reading through the reference guide that we wrote, and it's just follow the reference guide. It tells you everything you need to know. Okay, so that's really not one of the things that we want to see happen. The root causes of this is primarily inexperienced SPCs, a lack of good coaches on a side, and also inexperienced management that haven't been trained properly for the implementation. Therefore, they don't understand, the way to look at the framework and what it means. So we have insufficient training. So the thing is, the framework says, you want the guidance. Sorry, my screen has got a message on it here on my side. You can't see it. Let me just move that. So what we're going to see here is the framework is a bunch of success patterns. The framework was built over years by looking at the successful implementation patterns that other people have used. So there's sets of patterns. It's not a methodology in that we describe that you must do these things. It requires experience. So when you're beginning that journey, realistically, I've taught a lot of training classes. And one thing that I always let my students know before they leave is I use that line from a video, from the Backwards Bike video, is that you have knowledge, but you don't have understanding. And I always make sure that they understand that when they go back to their company and they're going to be taking on any implementation tasks, that they need to sit down and talk with their management about getting good coaching. You need to have experienced coaches to help you get past some of the challenges you're going to have. And one of those challenges is obviously, when you run into implement things in the framework that don't match up with something the company wants to do, and then you have to make a decision. Some people just say, we're just going to follow the framework, but it's really meant to be a discussion. Sit down and think about, well, what do we need to do here? Do we have to do this right now? Can we do it a little later? There's lots of different things that you can then choose to decide to do, but it takes experience to do that. So always have good experienced coaches when you begin any implementation. Obviously, the last point here, focusing on the values and the principles, these are the immutable guardrails. So the 10 SAFe principles we have, that are, on top of the House of Lean, on top of the Agile manifestos, values and principles, and on top of the core values, The 10 SAFe principles are there for when we begin to implement the framework. They provide us the guidance when we're running into challenges with the practices. So if we think about we're going to make some changes, we always want to come back to those foundational principles and values and ask ourselves, if we change this, are we still being true? That being said, I think the practical reality of this is most people make some sort of changes to the framework. And they simply do this because sometimes it's a necessity. They just can't do something. So a good example of this might be weighted shortest job first. Some people can't get to weighted shortest job first immediately. That doesn't mean that you have to do it because it's in the framework, but you as an SPC need to understand what is the value? What does it give us? If you go without it, what is it going to do to us? Right? So that's your job as an SPC. When the customer or your client is telling you that we're not going to do this, or we want to add something to the framework, your job as an SPC is to guide them on that decision-making, help them understand the pros and the cons of either. Right? Ultimately, we would want weighted shortest job in first because it's a nice, systematic way of doing prioritization. But if they can't do it right now, then maybe you're better off to move on from that discussion and come back to it later. Put it on your impediments backlog so you can come back to it. Another example is funding, right? One of the most common things, funding. Can't fund the value streams because we really haven't won that discussion yet with the financial people in the organization. So, okay, how are we going to fund this for now? Find a way to do it for now, but you want to come back to that discussion. But there are consequences for the effectiveness of SAFe if you don't fund the value stream. And so your job is to help the customer understand, what those consequences are, and then help them make the right decision. Number two, this is really the implementing SAFe in name only. So Steve liked to call this, waterfall, instead of sheep and wolf in sheep's clothing, he calls this a waterfall in sheep in SAFe clothing. Right, so that's kind of, I guess, where he came up with this picture from. But the reality of this is that, it's a common pattern that organizations, because they're switching from, decades of doing, waterfall development and using projects, trying to suddenly shift themselves away from that can be very difficult. So Agile in general has suffered this as a problem, and and SAFe suffers this as well, is that people bring in SAFe or they bring in any other framework, and what people do is like, great, we'll call it that, but underneath we want to do these things. And this relates back to the first point. They begin to change the framework to match the way they currently work. And so what they end up doing is, you've got the framework's name on the top, we're doing this, but you still end up doing, the traditional approaches underneath. And so some of the things that you will see or the common excuses you get, well, governance tells you this. So management will go back to governance and they say, our governance requires us to have a requirements document. It requires us to have phase gates. And so you start to have those sorts of discussions. And, and again, maybe they're not well enough trained. They haven't really understood how SAFe organizes and executes for them to get away from that. My favorite one is we have to do SAFe differently. So a lot of organizations, before they understand how to do something, want to change it and do it differently for them. Again, this is usually underlying this is usually the need to avoid having to make a difficult change in the organization. So it's easier to change the framework. And so the excuse is, well, we do SAFe differently here. Right? I've sat in numerous meetings and had that discussion. Well, you're doing differently. Tell me what you're going to be doing differently. And what you find is they start to remove some of the more important pieces of SAFe because they're adhering to their governance. You see a lot of people are stressed and overloaded, right? So again, when you're implementing this and you're not removing the older ways of working, the stress of those things, people fully committed, etc., those sorts of things remain. And so people still remain overcommitted to their work and they start to burn out. The root causes of this, expecting the benefits of lean and agile while preserving their legacy practices. So again, even though we educate leadership on the benefits of lean and agile approaches, it doesn't mean they actually learn and understand that. And so more often than not, when you finish teaching a leading SAFe class, whether you're doing it, as part of an informative approach, or you're doing it as part of the implementation, what you're going to find there is that they don't necessarily come out of the training course completely enlightened. They've usually got questions. They're mulling over things in their head. Some of them are looking at it immediately. That's not going to work here. I'm going to do this my way. You're always wanting to, as an SPC, to follow up. Make sure you're having follow-up conversations with leadership to start to understand, well, what did they get from this? What do they think the next steps are going to be, right? And so that kind of lays into this next part, that the mindset has not changed. Remember, in SAFe, we really switch leadership from that fixed mindset to this, what we call the growth mindset. We want them to do something simple as decentralize decision-making. And it's funny that Gerald says that's simple. The concept is simple, right? But certainly the challenge of getting them to decentralize that decision-making can be very, very difficult. So again, you really want to sit down and see, with leadership and the people that are going to be sponsoring the implementation, did they really understand the mindset? Did they really understand the change that's going to be coming? So the guidance is there is to make sure that leadership understands and they commit to the values and the principles. That's why we push on that so hard. The first day of leading SAFe is pretty much just values and principles, with some exercises to help reinforce those. So you really want to follow up on that side as an SPC and make sure that that's really well ingrained. Implementing some strangle patterns to phase things out. So again, you may not be able to change everything at once. So one of the things that we can do is an architectural approach, which is they call strangle patterns, which is you begin to implement around the pieces and you slowly eliminate the older practices in favor of new ones. In architecture, we slowly implement newer ways of doing architecture, phasing out older ways of doing architecture. So that just really says that you can't change everything at once, maybe your first time, but have a plan on how you're going to do it. Fundamentally, go back, make sure people are reading the articles. Again, what happens is people come out of a training course and they're great, I've got all the knowledge, and they pass their exam, and they might have read the articles, and they stop, right? They don't go back and they don't reapproach articles, they don't reread articles, they don't keep up with the new stuff that's coming up in the blog posts or new articles. We want to encourage a learning organization. That's one of our core competencies, right? So, we want to create a learning organization, and part of that is continuing to read and understand and apply SAFe. So around number 3, I love this picture actually. So this is this focus on vanity metrics, right? So again, metrics that are vanity metrics are things that we like to report that make us feel good or they make us look good, right? So I've had executives, I had an executive once wipe out a 25 list of metrics that the agile teams were planning on using. He whittled it down to I think it was 5 or 7 metrics. And you only had to achieve 4 of those to be considered agile, right? So again, metrics can be very dangerous if they're not truly relating to some significant outcomes. If they're not relating to valuable outcomes, they're not going to be useful. So a common one that we see here is number of people trained, number of arts launched, etc. So while these are valuable in some way, they don't change your organization. They aren't necessarily the thing that's getting you the outcome. Launching arts, training people, all those sort of things are not necessarily going to give you the outcomes you're looking for. So if you're in an organization where it's totally focused on training people, then that's not going to get the outcome. Another common one is using velocity. It's one of my favorite ones that people tend to use velocity as a measure of value. Oh, the team increased their velocity by 50%. It's like, well, that means nothing, because velocity is nothing more than a planning metric, right? So we want to make sure that the metrics being used really point us to outcomes. So some of the root causes of this is that they focused on the steps of the roadmap. And again, here they're focused on the training. So they're not asking themselves, well, what does each step in the roadmap drive as a benefit? So for example, if I've gotten through the value stream workshop and I've now organized an agile release training and I've got people organized into teams and I've trained them, That's useful in terms of knowing where we're at in implementation, but it's not a valuable metric in terms of, are we changing the organization? The number of people trained doesn't mean you've changed the organization, right? That's not the outcome. That just means you've got a bunch of trained people who don't know what they're doing necessarily. So we need to make sure we follow up that with, good outcome metrics, right? Are we releasing more features? Are we improving our quality? Do we have better continuous integration? So we're starting to look for those things that are real valuable metrics to us. Predictability is the biggest metric we tend to use. So we'll talk about that here in a second. So again, to avoid this, we have to really go back, look at the metrics article in the framework, right? And you see some good examples of what we think are valuable metrics, but coaching leadership on what valuable metrics are, right? Just meeting a date for delivery of a document is not a valuable metric. Meeting the end of a time box and delivering working software that the business finds valuable is far more useful. And so we look at teams from this notion. We have this thing we call the predictability measure. So this is where business provide value, their assessment of value. They talk with the teams about the value being delivered, and they give them a measure on that. And at the end of the PI, we assess the teams, how well the teams met that value. And so here what we see is that we form what we call a predictability measure, which really says that when the team is committing to a set of objectives, they're 85–90% predictable in terms of meeting those objectives. If you were then to relate that to other things like cost, for example, a team that's 90% predictable, that burns $1 million a PI is good value, as opposed to a team that's 50% predictable and I'm burning a lot of money here. Excuse me, I don't have any water in my room here. I've come unprepared. Okay, so the next one here, prioritizing ceremonies over technical excellence. So, to be clear, the team and the train, the portfolio, these level events are really important. We have a lot of events in SAFe, but what's more important than the event itself is the outcomes. And so we want to go through these sorts of outcomes, and we want to make sure that we run those events well, they run on time, they run, in an orderly way. But, if you're coming out of the event and you're not coming out with the outcomes you're looking for, then the focus is on the event and not on the outcome. So here we want to make sure that you're not, overemphasizing the choreography of the event itself. It is pretty important, though, to make them fun and to make them interesting. So I think Hollywoodizing it might be a bit much, but certainly you want to make it fun and valuable. But if you're coming out of PI planning and you don't have a good set of PI objectives and a dependency board that shows major dependencies, if the teams don't have their plans well established, then the focus is in the wrong place. It's not about attending and enjoying the events, attending and getting the outcome. Those events cost money for the organization. So you want to make sure that if they're putting in the money and burning up the money that's budgeted for the value stream, that they're really getting the value for that. So some of the root causes of this is that, we decrease the technical depth, of outside teams. And so again, as we don't focus on, the technical capability of the team, they're coming to these events and they don't really have a good idea of how to solve the problems coming out of these events, right? So, if you don't have architecture in the room, or if the teams are, poorly trained in development techniques, then they're going to build up a lot of code that's, not going to be well written. They're going to have a lot of that, what's the word for it? I can't think of it, technical debt, right? And so we want to make sure that if they're coming into those sorts of things, that they're really able to solve those problems inside those events. So again, the guidance here in SAFe is the reverse training maneuver, teams and trains leaders. So we train everybody. That's why we talk about it. We launch trains, we train everyone. Right. And so again, other things that we want to ensure that we're doing is not focusing on the events as much as we're focusing on support of knowledge. Knowledge is the key that really makes the trains effective. And so here we're gonna operationalize. You can use informal ways, such as communities of practice, coding dojos, or architectural dojos I've seen. We want to emphasize this notion of relentless learning. So we want people to continuously learn, right? If they have an interest in an area, then we need to provide time and space as leadership, provide that time and space for people to actually learn. So whether they use the iteration, the planning iteration that we have at the end as a bit of space for learning, or whether we actually take the time to let people go to training courses, and we take the hit in the productivity. So number 5 here, which is again, accepting dependencies as immutable. So this is one of the things that people often feel like dependencies cannot be changed, right? And so here is one of those things in SAFe where people, when we talk about implementing SAFe, people focus on PI planning and the fact that we can discover dependencies, but they really miss the important part, which is when we design the agile release trains, when we're building the trains, or when we're deciding on the value streams, that is the time, that is the best time you can actually begin to lighten the dependencies. So we make sure, for me, when I do the value stream workshop, the first thing I start to look at is, well, when I look at the solutions each value stream is operating, how, what kind of dependencies am I seeing there? Dependencies in terms of the people that are going to be on those development value streams, dependencies in terms of the architecture or the infrastructure that's going to be across the solution that those value streams work on. So we begin to try and identify those, because then you build agile release trains on top of that. And so you deepen that dependency problem if you don't begin to identify it. Then when you build teams inside the agile release train, you deepen the dependencies even more. So first of all, remove dependencies at the design stage. Try to create development value streams that can build and release products independently as much as possible. Try to design them where you have, reduced dependencies on people in amongst the train. So make sure you've got the right skill sets. Make sure you understand what shared services are really going to be truly available to you. If you implement the team topology approach, get your streamlined teams, know which are going to be component types of teams or trains. Where are you going to have platform trains? So the team topology approach really begins to help us actually remove dependencies even more. So the board looks like a yarn factory. That's how you'll see it. If you put a dependency board up, you see a lot of red lines, whether it's virtual or in person, you see a lot of red lines going here. That is one of the ways that you'll note that you have a lot of dependencies. And so if you see that, you're first going to work your way backwards. You're going to look at the teams and say, well, how can I reduce dependencies between the teams? And then maybe the trains. And there's like, the ultimate question might get asked, well, do I need to redesign my development value streams? The root cause of this is a lack of understanding to reducing dependencies via team art and formation. So that's everything I was just saying, is that when you design the development value streams, the arts and the teams, that is the time to be thinking about dependencies. It's also a time to reduce other kinds of things. For example, time zones. If you're putting people on trains that are across, really broad time zones, that's going to cause you some other challenges, and that can exacerbate those dependencies. So we want all teams and trains, right, to be able to release and design, build, and release code as independently as possible. All right. So again, as you're looking at this, if you're seeing a lot of red string on your dependency board, that means that there's a lot of risk in terms of your ability to actually deliver the working software. Architectural investments are going to be needed. So realistically, one of the conversations I have early on before I begin implementation is I sit down with architecture and development management, and I want to know everything about the infrastructure. What is the infrastructure? What is the current state of the infrastructure? What does it look like? What are the upcoming changes to the infrastructure? Same with the architecture. What is the current state of the architecture? What major changes are coming for the architecture or are already in flight for that architecture? You want to know these things, first of all, because that might influence what goes in your backlog and what you work on first. You want to solve architectural problems early on, especially when you're coming into a brand new train. that's living with, somewhat legacy systems. And guarantee you, you're probably going to have to fix architectural challenges first. So number 6, overloading the organizational capacity. So one of the most common problems, obviously, is that, we have this notion where we focus on utilization, right? So Reinertsen saying that any system running at 100% utilization is an economic disaster. And so really we want to see that organizations, as they come into implementing SAFe, are adopting the good agile practices that we don't want teams overloaded. We're going to manage capacity and demand. And so some of the things you'll see is predictability remains low. So if teams are not becoming very predictable, if the train is not very predictable in delivery, then one of the things you might look is, well, are people busy? Are they too busy? And there's no room for them to react to any changes that come along, right? So the time to the mission. So again, when work is flowing from iteration to iteration, or when features are not getting finished within the PIs, then that's going to tell you that you've more than likely got a capacity problem. The other thing too is you burn people out. So when we constantly overload them, we burn them out. This is why in SAFe we build buffers in, to the actual execution. So we have the innovation and planning iteration at the end to give a little bit of a buffer, but we also do this with PI objectives, or we use the uncommitted objectives to allow the team to not be fully committed to the work. So again, we want to educate leadership on this. It's very important to help educate leadership to shift them from I need to keep people busy view of the world to focusing on the delivery of value. So some of the root causes for this is capacity is not understood. So again, making sure management understand the relationship between capacity, how much time people have and the amount of load, and making sure it's visualized. So again, this is one of the reasons why we have the teams write their load and capacity, so we see it. Having burn down charts and burn up charts are those things that are visible when things are being executed, helps us understand, how the teams are managing against their capacity and load. So again, the guidance around here is train and implement the LPM. So if you're implementing, your stakeholders, your lean portfolio management need to understand this, because sometimes the load and capacity is not just for the teams below, it can also be at the portfolio level. So more often than not, the portfolio is trying to get everything done and people are overloaded. So again, implementing a Kanban, implementing work in process limits helps to create a flow of work in those places that are not development oriented. So the product management team, not letting them get overburdened, right, is another one, or the solution management team, if you're doing large SAFe. Conducting portfolio level problem level solving. So again, you can run retrospectives at the portfolio level on a regular basis where they can take a look at how they've been doing. So that's a useful activity to actually undertake. And also empowering leaders. So making sure that, people can stop the train, right? They can stop particular activities. They can say no to work is one of the important things. So that empowerment at different levels, it becomes really important here. So one of the last things here is over-reliance on opinion over data. In SAFe, we like to say facts are friendly. And so if you look at principle number 5, we always make decisions and review, decisions based around fact, right? So that's why at every time box, we demonstrate, we look at the metrics. So we can make decisions based on real facts from data we're gathering from the execution of the train or from production, rather than actually making decisions around people's opinions or their positions or other things. So what becomes important here is that, you want a consistent, you're looking to identify, decisions that are made consistently that get the same bad results. So we start to see that as like, okay, so we're making that decision all the time and the results are not changing. We need to do something different. A common one you'll see is lots of meetings that take place and there's like, I think the boss wants. So they're very subjective statements in terms of what wins or the customer wants. So the customer may want that, but do the facts bear out, from your market analysis that that's actually going to be a good idea. I had a customer in China who asked me once, how do I satisfy all of my customers? And the reality is, well, you don't satisfy all your customers. What you do is you do your market analysis and you work out where the best bang for your buck is in terms of the value to be delivered. You may not satisfy all the customers, but you want to satisfy, as many as you can. The root causes is an over-reliance on anecdotal evidence. So again, those vanity metrics we talked around, they can be the root cause here. People who really don't have facts and they're making decisions based on their position or based on discussions they have. So you sometimes run into that because I said so leadership. So again, training leadership becomes an important part here because we need their mindset set to shift. So as we say in SAFe, the facts are friendly. So, look at the metrics, use those metrics as a way of making decisions that are based on real outcomes, right? Investing in data science is really important. So an increasing domain in all organizations and increasing overhead for organizations is this note of big data and data analysis, right? So more and more we're moving from warehouses to these large pools of cloud-based data and using artificial intelligence to plow through that data to tell us the patterns of what's going on. So we can do the same thing here. So SAFe in the future will start to think about those sorts of things and provide guidance on how do we start to incorporate, the data from running the train and executing, our software, and how do we pull that back and make real decisions about what we're seeing. Leaders need to become data fluent. So again, another aspect for leadership will be that they have to become familiar with the kinds of metrics we talk about and how those metrics are gathered. Okay, so I'm not sure of my timing here, but I've pretty much gone through all of these. So I think now's a good time to lay out questions for people that want to go through these. So what questions do you guys want to cover?
Yes, sorry to interrupt, but just before we jump into that, Rob has joined us. So if you can, guys, just keep the questions for a second. Rob, can you give us some good news?
Yeah, so sure thing, Mahal. Yeah, yep. So look, I don't have any slides to share, and it's a meetup, so we can just chat. So yeah, introductions. Rob Howard, I work alongside Gerald. I'm Asia Pac VP. I'm based in the Blue Mountains. Gerald, with his Australian accent, is however based in Singapore, but we work side by side, and just wanted to give you an update on what's happening at Scaled Agile. So yeah, thanks, Mahal. So yeah, we just announced at Global SAFe Summit last week that we've gone through the 1 million people trained barrier at Scaled Agile, which is a big number. Doesn't really mean anything apart from being a milestone, but what it means for enterprise customers that use the framework is that there's an enormous and always growing pool of people that have been trained in SAFe and understand the framework and know how to apply it in that enterprise and government context. So from that perspective, it's really helpful for practitioners and organisations using the framework. Locally, in the first half of this year, Australia's numbers grew by 62% over the first half of 2020. So incredible growth in Australia, and the APAC team has doubled since the start of this year. So, Scaled Agile is investing heavily in the region. Customers across every vertical industry. In Australia, there's 15 out of the top 20 federal government agencies now using SAFe, which is pretty cool. And I'm hearing about a new state government agency in New South Wales getting going with SAFe, every few weeks. So it's really starting to take hold in state government here as well. For Gerald and I and the rest of the APAC team, we've really got two jobs, and that is to help organisations get started with SAFe. So help with getting the leadership groups buy-in, and helping organisations with the advice that they need to make that decision to go with SAFe for scaling agile practices. And then the other job that we have is that once organisations are on that journey, helping them be successful with it. And we do that through the help of our network of partners And I can see, Mahal from DXC here on the call and Andrew from Fujitsu. So we've got incredibly capable partners in region to help people, stick with the SAFe journey and be successful with it. Otherwise, it's just not worth doing, really, is it? Because it's a big change. Look, that's really it from me. And, back to the question piece, with Gerald and I here, and thanks for having us on the meetup. Ask us anything. We've got plenty of time, so fire away.
Many thanks for that, Rob. Yeah, guys, questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Mehul.
I'm not as proficient yet in the SAFe, and often I get asked about Scrum Master full-time job. That's the first question, that why do we need Scrum Master for the full-time? And can Scrum Master can do other things? And second thing, the delivery management role. Delivery management role, there's no specification in SAFe. However, that role is needed. So what is the SAFe view on it? Okay.
So with the Scrum Master role, I mean, the short answer is, yeah, it's actually pretty essential especially when you're launching new trains. So even if you're just doing a basic Agile team, when a team is brand new, even outside of SAFe, your Scrum Master needs to be full-time simply because they're going to be very busy and they're there to help keep an eye and keep the team guided on, good Agile practices and approaches, right? So it's people look at their job and think that, oh, they're not doing anything valuable, but essentially they're coaching the team, right? If they're an experienced Scrum Master on a team, they're going to be coaching that team till that team becomes more self-sufficient. Right? If they're inexperienced, then hopefully you're coaching the Scrum Master so that they're going to learn how to coach the team. But they need to be there full time because the team is pretty busy with the work and there are things that the team should not be doing. They should be focused on learning at this point. Now, I have seen as teams become more and more mature, the Scrum Master can sometimes be more part-time. And I've seen situations where the team feels like, well, we know what we need to do here. We don't really need to have a Scrum Master anymore. So as maturity levels increase, you can get that pattern. But I will say when you get into an environment that's a multi-team environment, like SAFe is going to support, and you're dealing with 130, 125 people in a train, then you really do need to have the Scrum Masters because the teams need to be focused on what their job is doing, which is designing and building and integrating and delivering the solution, right, that needs to be done. So the Scrum Masters are going to be pretty valuable there. They've got a lot more work to do in that environment, which is they're going to be talking to other Scrum Masters. They're helping to solve the impediments that come up in that environment. They're pretty important. So I think early on the simple answer, and management asked that question, because they probably haven't had enough training, right? They probably don't truly understand what Agile is and what the Scrum Master actually does. And you've really got to be able to help them understand the value. Without that Scrum Master there, the teams are going to be less effective, okay? Because they're just going to run into problems. They're going to get caught up on stuff. So the delivery manager role. So typically when if you've ever seen, the discussion we often have with SAFe, you see a picture where you have the hierarchy on one side and you've got the network on the other side. So really when we're implementing SAFe, what we're saying is that we're going to take the value creation that we deliver to customers, we're going to move that away from the hierarchy to another construct, another part of, a way of organizing the people, which is this value-oriented network. The development manager is a role in the hierarchy. Right. So typically there's no role for them in SAFe per se, because, we're not creating a hierarchy in SAFe. We're creating a set of roles that will execute against that continuous delivery pipeline, as a continuous delivery pipeline as an Agile release train. But that doesn't mean they're not valuable. Remember, the delivery manager is usually responsible for how people get assigned work. They're usually responsible for how tools and resources are used. So these are people we need to engage because we are saying to them that we're going to build this structure over here, but we need your help to do it. right? So they can choose to stay as part of the hierarchy. They're still going to have responsibilities in doing that. It's just that some of the day-to-day things they would have done before, which is manage people's utilization, will be something they no longer need to do because the teams are now dedicated. But we may need their help in understanding infrastructure or making some infrastructure or architectural decisions and some tooling decisions, right? Because early on, especially, the money's still sitting over in the hierarchy. So if we need to buy some tooling or platform work, you often have to go to them to get that discussion done. So we need the support. Travelocity is a company, Travelport is a company in Colorado. If you watch some of the videos we have on them, so if you look for Travelport videos on YouTube, you can see that if you look at the title of some of the people in the PI planning discussion, they're actually people from the hierarchy. You have the VP of technology sitting there telling, so he's participating in the launch, and the PI planning, but he doesn't work day to day on that. Now, I have seen some managers switch over and take on roles within the train, such as release train engineer or business owner. But typically these people, they remain in the hierarchy, but they are important to help us actually be able to get those trains off the ground.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
What other questions?
So Gerald, I quite often get asked about project managers as well. So similar to service delivery leads. And when people get exposed to SAFe for the first time, their first question is, well, where do project managers fit in this? So, then I have to go through the process of explaining there's no such thing as a project in SAFe, and it becomes quite a deep dive discussion. So how do you combat that question?
I had a little fun story. I was doing this for a large car company in the US, and we were sitting down, and when I arrived at this company, they were doing Agile, right? So waterfall in this agile world. And, so they had teams in all separate rooms operating in projects. They had a project manager on each team. And so we went through the education part, and the lead project manager, was very resistant to all of this. And, the project managers on the teams, they're all resistant, but we had to explain that there are roles they can choose to fill. The important thing for project managers is to not tell them they're out of a job, is to tell them what you're going to be doing is learning new skills. Right. So what you've learned as a project manager was valuable to the company when you were doing projects. SAFe doesn't operate with projects, but we do operate in this highly collaborative, integrated kind of environment. So as a Scrum Master, you will learn new skills and you'll be doing these. If you don't want to be a Scrum Master, that's fine. There are other roles you might have skill sets for. And so we did look to, but the fun I had with the lead project manager, she's like, well, what are we going to do with the project manager? I looked at her and I just went, for the fun of it, of course, just to see her face. But then I said, then we looked at what other trains had been doing within that organization, and we looked at how they manage their project managers. A lot of them went to Scrum Master roles. Some of them chose to go back and do development work. They wanted to go back and rejoin teams, right? Others become release train engineers. Some of them join the product management side. So there are ways to do this, but ultimately, when we move people who've come from a project management background, we have to ensure that they don't become project managers on the trains, right? And so we just need to make sure that we coach them and try and teach them. But we position this as you're going to learn new skills, because today you're on an agile release train. Tomorrow your organization might take you back and put you on a waterfall project if you want to. Right. So it's adding to their skill set, not taking the job away. Now, an important thing here is, when you begin your train implementations, you are going to come across the development managers, testing managers, project managers, and business analysts who are all going to look at this and go, well, where's my job? What's happening to my job? Remember, these are roles that SAFe provides. They're not jobs. Now some companies are making them into job descriptions. They're roles people fulfill with the right skill sets. So the company still might be paying you as a project manager, but you might be a Scrum Master on a team. Right. So again, this is why it's important to get HR involved, so they understand, what does it mean to have people play different roles on organizations or on this construct, but still be paid according to the hierarchical construct they came from. All right, so that's one of the things. So it's also important to make sure management is out front, you know, talking to people openly about what the transition means, because otherwise the rumor mill gets going, and people, you find good people start leaving the company because they think they're going to lose their job.
And the other thing we've found is that people just immediately assume that a project manager is going to be a scrum master. And I've found that that's not always been the case, because I've had some scrum masters going back to using Gantt charts and Microsoft Project when they're working in scrum teams. So I think it's really important to have the right personality for that role, not just because they're a project manager, they're going to make a good scrum master.
Yeah, I've had that same experience. I mean, that's why it's very important that they understand as they take on the role of scrum master, it's not a mini project manager. Right, you're not now just managing a team, so it's important to coach them. And you know, some people just cannot make that switch. I've had people who just cannot make that switch, and so you know, we find a waterfall project for them. You know, they're not comfortable on one train. You know, what we did was we actually needed a lot of help on the train from logistics. Right, so rather than our release train engineer being responsible for logistics around the train, such as finding a space for events, or you know, managing finances or other things, we actually put a small group of project managers up onto the program side to support the release train engineer, the business owner, and product. And so there was just 3 of them, and they were responsible for bringing people onto the train, taking people off the train. They're responsible for the funding, you know, helping manage the funding discussion. So they act like a little bit of a, you know, a lace, or a little bit of a, you know, an agile project management office. But they were, in this case, they were just buried into the train.
Any other questions, guys? Not probably a curvy one, Gerald. I always kind of ask the same question. Sorry, it's the default one. When we approach a customer or a team, a leadership team, for example, how do you get them to determine what is value for them? How do you get them to specify? Because then that drives everything else.
I think a lot of it is when you're initially engaging, you know, stakeholders or executives, it's really determining for them what is the value they're trying to get out of implementing an agile release train, right? And that always has to come back to what's the business value they're looking to achieve, right? So if the discussion is something about we need to implement agility in the organization, that's the wrong discussion. If the discussion falls to we need to improve our ability to deliver value to our customers, right? We're failing at that right now. Our quality is bad. We're late on releases. If those sorts of discussions are taking place, then it's easy to connect that to the current way of working. The fact that they're buried in a hierarchy in silos and they're doing projects, right? Because that's the gap that most managers or most stakeholders and executives don't get, is that they know the problem they have and they know the outcome they want, but they're not putting their finger on the problem, which is the fact that doing projects, or the fact that they're organized as a hierarchy and silos is actually what generates the problem, right? So helping them to understand that using SAFe as a framework for reorganization, right, as guidance for reorganization to get people dedicated to a customer, delivering value to that customer, is what gives them the ability to improve all of those outcomes. So you really need to be able to connect that for them, you know, connect the problem space, you know, connect the challenges they're having to the problem space that they're not aware of. That's what gets them through the tipping point.
Awesome, thank you. More questions, guys? This is a rare opportunity to have someone like Gerald, by the way, in the team. So fire off.
Hello, hi, Daniel Tan here. I'm from Cochlear Limited in Sydney. Yeah, it's been a very nice presentation and also very good discussion so far from you guys. Thoroughly enjoy it. I've got a question here myself. Just, you know, basically a little bit of the background. In Cochlear, we've been you know, practicing some form of SAFe for the last 6 years for our R&D product development programs. So the program typically involves, you know, hardware projects, software as well as firmware projects as well. And also seen organizations that actually, when they do their PI planning, they actually involve multiple programs, you know, not just one program. So we'd like to get your opinion on this. Do you think it's feasible to actually extend SAFe, to cover multiple programs and do the planning, for different programs together at the same time? Yeah.
And when you say multiple programs, do you mean multiple trains?
Oh yeah,
multiple agile release trains?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they got multiple agile release trains as well. Yeah.
And are those trains related to the same solution that's being developed, or are they developing in solutions independently?
Or different? I think the different one independently. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen people try that. Usually the question I'd ask is, well, what's the benefit in having them plan at the same time in one place? So is there any reason why they're doing that? Was something doing that?
Yeah, they basically plan the resources at the same time as well. So like, let's say this program has this project that require this many software resources, then they will allocate the resources for that project. And then after that, another program will get maybe that has a lower priority will get only fewer resources.
Now I see why. So the resources, people are being shared across these trains, right?
That's correct. Yes, that's how they do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So right in there, I mean, there's some behaviors that are showing some challenges with the design and the understanding of what SAFe is, right? So, SAFe is meant to organize ultimately around value. So let's say you're building a product for a customer, right? Over the time, the traditional way is we run lots of projects to enhance that product. But what we're saying now is we now organize a dedicated group of people who operate for that product, and they're on an agile release train. So they should be independent of every other agile release train. So they should be able to just plan on their own and operate their own cadence. It's not, I mean, it's going back to something that seems completely unrelated to that is the important part, right? Getting them back to understanding that, because now what they're doing is what they're actually doing is doing multiple project planning in one room.
Yep.
Right. And so they're not. So again, the thing I said, doing SAFe in name only is a good example of what's going on there. Right. So they're not implementing the true structure that SAFe was looking. And even though we talked about SAFe not being, prescriptive, it isn't prescriptive, but it is sensitive to the design. So if you're not organizing around value, if that's not the basis from which you start, then everything else is going to go not so well.
Okay.
Right. So I'd be taking them back to we need to go back and revisit the concept of value streams, understand what SAFe organizes around, understand and make that shift away from projects to value streams, having dedicated people. That being said, I've seen organizations that do have trains plan on the same time, but usually the trains are actually on a large solution. And so they need to plan at the same time because each train is building a component of that solution. So they do need to plan together more often than not. But if the purpose of planning together is just simply for coordinating resource movement or people movement, then that's probably not the best idea. So I think there's a fundamental design structure that probably needs fixing there.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. What else, guys? I'm happy to answer questions. I can do this all day, but I do want to get a cup of coffee at some point.
Oh, you'll be
Or a
right.
beer.
Hey, on the naming piece, so I'm hearing quite often that people are practicing SAFe, but they don't necessarily call it SAFe. They might give it its own name internally to reflect the way of working that the organization's taken on. And so to get people engaged in it, they might give it a name like Accelerate or company and way of working, company name and way of working, that sort of thing. Do you see much of that, Gerald?
Yeah, one of the common things you will see is people try to change the names of things in SAFe to make it more palatable to the organization's DNA. So they don't. I walked into a bank here in Singapore, and I was told I was going to be doing SAFe, and when I walked in the door, they're like, "Whatever you do, don't mention the word SAFe." It's like, okay, what are we doing here? So and it's simply because it's not that they've been exposed to SAFe, they were so burnt out with trying different approaches and failing at stuff that no one wanted to try anything new. So that's one thing you see. Other things you'll see is no one wants the term, we don't want the term product manager, we want the term something X. And so they do start to change terms to make it kind of, you know, look and feel like something the organization's been trying and doing. And I don't look at that as the worst problem when they change a name. What I look for is you're changing the name, but are you changing the behavior as well? So, you know, they do change, like, for example, Air France, not that they did this badly, but I listened to a presentation from Air France at one of our, you know, summits a year ago. And instead of, you know, an agile release train, they had an agile release plane, you know, because they're an airline. So they changed it to plane. And I was sitting next to Jennifer Fawcett at the time, and I just watched her like shaking their heads, right? And it's just a name change, but sometimes the name change is an indicator of more bigger problems to come.
I like fun. Wow. I want to do that.
It actually stands for Fujitsu Unified New Ways of Working. So
that's nowhere near as exciting.
But it's fun with a wow factor. That's how we sell it.
Yeah.
But
the other reason people do this is because they want to make it feel like the organization is not just adopting something, but they're creating something. And so it's a creative thing. Citibank, Citibank here? Citibank, I had a discussion with them, and they've been trying to adopt SAFe locally here, and they were changing all the names to suit the way they were doing this. You know, an insurance company, Cigna, for example, back when I worked and lived in the US, changed the name on everything on the framework so they could make it fit to what people were doing. So I think you just have to be careful if the initiative is expressed in a certain way, then that's fine. But once you begin to change the framework, the problem you have is you as one part of the organization implement the framework with these name changes. Then another part of the organization implements with their name changes. And before long, your goose train engineer and your release train engineer and your plane train engineer don't know what each other actually does. So it just depends.
It's actually FunWow powered by SAFe. And that's how we brand it. So we're keeping strictly to SAFe, well, as strictly as we can. We have changed teams to squads though. So we've borrowed some terms from Spotify model. Yeah,
I had a class once where I watched a guy, you know, because in class we used to give out that template of the framework, you know, the picture. And I watched him diligently writing things on the picture, you know, as I was talking. And then when I went past and I looked at what he was doing, he was actually crossing out all the SAFe names and writing all the Spotify names. And when I asked him why, he just said, well, because we've been implementing Spotify, so I want to know how to map SAFe to Spotify. And, you know, I immediately kicked him out of the class because I didn't kick him out of the class, but no, it was just one of those things where you just like, wow, I'm going to have some interesting times here, you know, watching them how to do this. But yeah, I've seen that's a pretty common one. And that's a really innocuous change where someone turns the team as a squad, you know, because, you know, but it's again, it depends. You know, if you look at Spotify doesn't look at organizing around value. It organizes around what's the most important thing that they want the teams to work on. So again, you have to start to look at, you know, did they actually change the behavior of the team in SAFe?
Sorry, Ben, you have something to ask?
Yeah, thanks, Mahal, and thanks, Gerald. Look, not so much a SAFe question, but more so I'm interested in what you're seeing and what organizations are doing, obviously adapting to the post-COVID era. One of the big things about Agile is that we love to co-locate teams, and obviously we've been going through a couple of years of, you know, all working from home. And I guess, yeah, I'm interested in sort of what you're seeing and hearing around hybrid ways of working, around what organizations are doing to adapt, because obviously we're not going back to the way things were.
Yeah, I think for SAFe we'll have some fun with this, and we'll add principle number 11 is co-location requires double vaccination. You know, so we'll do stuff like that. But I do think this is the move that was caused by the pandemic has been pretty dramatic for many organizations. But you know, what we've really seen is many organizations, you know, large enterprises have really managed to adapt very well. right? We put out a lot of guidance. So one of the things when this started going down back in, March of 2020, one thing we realized very, very quickly is that we needed to provide ways for our instructors and our teachers and our customers out there to move offline. And we developed a lot of guidance very quickly. Early drafts of the guidance were not great. They were, they were rough, but, it's been refined, very quickly by our product teams. We literally dropped our prioritized backlog of things that we were working on, and they reprioritized a whole lot of stuff for that. So, we do SAFe, and so we literally reprioritized all the work, at the start of a PI that we just committed to when we realized what was going to happen. Fortunately for us out there, that, there were plenty of good tools available for people to latch onto to be able to perform, a great deal of remote work. We provided a lot of guidance for instructors and for doing remote PI planning, but ultimately it comes down to the people who are doing this to ensure that they're well organized. How are they going to go from doing PI planning with 100 people in a room to doing PI planning with 100 people in individual locations? That means, oh geez, I got to have a conversation with network, to make sure that we have a network infrastructure that can support all of these people dialing in. What if I have teams in India? What's going to happen there? Because, is the bandwidth going to be reliable? What happens with my teams in China because they're stuck behind the Great Firewall? So you do run into a lot of issues. So it really put a lot of onus on the teams to be well prepared. Technology is absolutely critical. Cannot do it without it. But that being said, tools like, Mural, Miro, SAFe Collaborate, which is our own tool, which is very, built from the ground up for this exact purpose, is very important to being able to do it. But, something as simple as, does everybody have a laptop that they can use that's going to be sufficient, to manage this online world? So there's a lot of stuff, but the move's been made. Now the question is, as we get to the tail end of this pandemic, if we ever get to it, right? What's going to happen? People do want to come back to the office. There are lots of teams that do want to be co-located and be back near each other, physically in an office. Some people are going to want to be remote. So when we get into that kind of hybrid structure, what's going to happen? I'm jealous of your background, by the way, because you're sitting outside in a nice sunny place.
Thank you. I'm taking the opportunity to get out from behind the laptop. And just to add on to that, I guess, a lot of discussion at the moment about the Great Resignation and what's going on in the US and the UK and what implications that could have. And I work in a digital space, so, talent is key at the moment. And again, I think, as you say, people have really been missing that. Some of the most basic human needs around interaction, interconnection. And yeah, I think one of the things we're really conscious of, and again, as Agile coaches, is how we can support people returning back. And again, right, we've got to support hybrid ways of working now, because we're not going to have a situation where, and as you say, right, people want to come back in, but people, I think more importantly, want choice. They want that sort of, I want to work from home because I love not having to commute, but I'll do that a few days a week and I'll go in the office. So I think we're sort of working through, how's this all going to look? And again, right, no one's got a crystal ball. I think it's about how you adapt and where's the value.
It's funny that organizations found themselves in uncharted waters at the start of the pandemic, and now we got out to sea and we survived the rough oceans, and now we're coming back to the shoreline, and it's like, well, where the hell is the shoreline now? It's uncharted waters all over again. Because there are organizations, that are taking the hard line. Yeah, you're coming back to work whether you like it or not, or you're going to lose your job. There are others that are trying to find that middle ground for people. A lot of this comes down to, what do people do as a job? How effective can they be in that job? I think organizations, despite some of the metrics, people say everyone's so much more productive remotely. I think those are very, metrics that are not supported with a great deal of depth. So I do think there's a lot more for organizations to begin to discover, but I do think they need to build flexibility in where that can be done.
Great. Thanks, Gerald.
You're welcome, mate.
Awesome, guys. Any more questions? Any more questions? If not, just a huge thanks to Gerald for bringing this to our knowledge, and Rob, again to you, many thanks for joining as well. Hope both of you can join us in the future meetups as well. But yeah, it would be awesome to see you a couple of more times again.
Yeah,
Let's kind of meet up in person.
Pizza and beer provided.
Are you
As-
looking
as-
to move them back to the DXC office, Michal?
Most likely, however, I think the DXC office has closed in the city, so I'm not quite sure how that'll go. The other official office is over at Macquarie Park, so North Ryde. So that's kind of a bit away for a lot of people because most people kind of focus. But let's see what happens. I think we can, ask maybe a favor or two and get it hosted somewhere else in the city. City is always kind of, best for everyone.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, guys. Thanks again
I guess we
to
have to be
you.
double vaxxed.
Come again?
I guess we have to be double vaxxed, in order to meet up, in the same place.
Oh, that's a good point, Daniel. Thank you. That's actually a good point.
Pass.
Bring your certificate. Yes, exactly. Thanks, Drew. Yeah. Guys, thank you very much for attending as well. It was it was awesome discussion, and thanks for chipping in as well. So until next time, take care.
Right,
Thank you
for organising.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Have a nice week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.